Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will examine the first of Iowa's Anglo-American settlements, which is Fort Madison. This small US Army fortification was plagued with problems during its short history from 1808 to 1813. Nevertheless, it became the later nucleus of white settlement for the city today known as Fort Madison. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Patrick Jung. Patrick earned his doctoral degree in United States history from the Marquette University in 1997 and has taught history and cultural anthropology at the Milwaukee School of Engineering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin since 2003. He has researched and written extensively on Indian-white relations in the region of the Western Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley. Patrick is particularly interested in the various strategies that Native people employed to resist the political and cultural colonialism of the United States. His recent article in the Annals of Iowa examines Native resistance in the Western Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley, and he is currently planning a book-length manuscript on this topic. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Patrick to begin the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank the State Historical Society of Iowa and the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs for this opportunity. And let me go to my title slide here. As mentioned, this is about Fort Madison, which was basically a predecessor to Anglo-American settlement. So let me kind of put this in chronological perspective. There have been human beings in Iowa for at least 11,000 years. There's been a strong Native presence. The first Europeans to arrive in Iowa were Father Marquette and Joliet in 1673. The first permanent Euro-American settlement, non-Native settlement, was when Julian Dubuque founded what is today Dubuque at the Spanish mines in 1796. That's something else I want to write about in the future. I don't think that it has really been adequately written about, and I've got a few ideas for writing about the history of early Dubuque. Now, as far as Anglo-American settlement, people from the Eastern Seaboard, English-speaking people who would later become United States citizens, that's sort of the last phase in Iowa's history. And in a sense, Fort Madison is key. When it's founded in 1808, it will be the first Anglo-American settlement, the first settlement by people who call themselves United States citizens. I wrote about this a little bit I wrote a book on the Black Hawk War many years ago. I wrote a little bit about Fort Madison's history. One thing to keep in mind, too, is that large-scale Anglo-American settlement, that will come after the Black Hawk War of 1832. That's sort of a pivotal event in Iowa's history. But writing that book and studying the Black Hawk War got me interested in Fort Madison. And as Jennifer mentioned, I had an article published in 2016 in the Annals of Iowa that I wrote as much as I could find out about Fort Madison, and everything I'm going over today pretty much is I go into greater length in that article. Well, first of all, we can categorize Fort Madison as a frontier fort. And I did a lot of research on the Frontier Army when I was a graduate student, and I continue to write about it. Now, I want to put this into a larger context of American history. And one of the things that academic historians are really forced to do before you can write about American history, you have to look at what American historians who came before you said about it. And in my case, sort of the doyen, the central figure in writing about frontier America was a University of Wisconsin professor, Frederick Jackson Turner. And in 1893, he came up with his famous frontier thesis, which for probably at least half a century was the dominant historical interpretation of American history. He argued that Americans who went out to the frontier were forced to return to what he called primitive conditions. And he said the early American frontier, from the colonial times all the way into the late 19th century, that experience, that return to primitive conditions, was the crucible of American democracy. Now, the reality was that when Turner wrote that in the 1890s, it was a product of its time. It held sway in the historical profession until about World War II. Then it began to unravel as other historians began to look more closely at what he was saying and some of the sources he used. And by the 1980s, it really wasn't, nobody really bought into the frontier thesis anymore. I certainly don't. If you look at the origins of American democracy, it takes place during the English Civil War and some of the thinkers of the Renaissance. It goes back really to Europe and the birth of democratic thought there. So it's still basically the frontier thesis today is sort of an artifact of among American historians like myself. Now, far more important to this talk, one of my professors in graduate school was Father Francis Paul Pruka, priest in the Society of Jesus. He was one of my professors at Marquette. And he was absolutely one of the most brilliant professors I had. He just died a few years ago. He had a modified version of Turner's thesis, and it focused on the U.S. Army. He said the U.S. Army was really sort of the cutting edge, the vanguard of the American frontier, because it brought concentrated manpower. They could use that to build forts and roads. It was directed manpower. It brought cash and money into the early frontier economies through things like contracts for animal fodder, like hay, or for firewood. And oftentimes early forts were the centers of settlement for later towns and villages. Now, he wrote about this in a book called Broad Axe and Bayonet. It was his first book, published in 1953, and he wrote dozens of books after that. He was a prolific scholar. And if you're interested in frontier America and American Indians, I highly, highly suggest all of his works. Well, he gave me a copy of Broad Axe and Bayonet when I was a young graduate student. I still have my copy of it. I hold it very dear. In fact, the picture on the right, I scanned my copy of it, just in honor of Father Pruka. But he developed what I call the frontier army thesis, that the Army had this crucial role to play in pushing America's frontier forward, westward. And if you look at sort of contemporary military historians like Robert Wooster, Samuel Watson, who write about the frontier army, it's clear that the frontier army thesis has much staying power. It certainly has had a much longer career than Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. Now, in some ways, Fort Madison adheres to Father Pruka's frontier army thesis. In some ways, it does not. It was, it did provide manpower in this largely, this largely sparsely settled area of the American frontier. And those soldiers who were there built a fort, they built an Indian trading house. So it adheres to the thesis in that way. It's different in other ways, though. It really wasn't the nucleus of white settlement. Now, there's numerous other forts that were built in the Midwest that adhere to that idea. Fort Dearborn was the nucleus of this for Chicago. Fort Detroit for Detroit. In Iowa, you had Fort Des Moines, which was in current present-day Des Moines. Fort Armstrong would be built on Rock Island, right across the river from Davenport. In the case of Fort Madison, it's going to be abandoned very early in its career. And there's going to be a 20-year period, 20-year lag behind when it was abandoned and when white settlement starts. And the early white settlers to Iowa will build a settlement called Fort Madison on the ruins of the earlier fort, but it had been gone for almost 20 years by the time that happens. This map here on the left shows some of the early forts that existed before the War of 1812 in the Midwest. And as you can see, everything north of Fort Madison, everything west of Fort Mackinac, it belonged to the United States, but it was basically, unoccupied. The United States had a very weak military presence in the region before the War of 1812. And of course, on the right, I have a picture of early Fort Madison shortly after settlement began in 1832. Fort Madison is going to be like all of these forts. It's going to be small, it's going to be weak, and it's going to be undermanned. And now we can get into some of the problems Fort Madison had. It's really not a heroic story. From beginning to end, Fort Madison was just beset with problems. First of all, we can look at the period immediately before Fort Madison is built. In 1805, a young Army officer, Zebulon Pike, he makes a journey up the Mississippi River to its headwaters, and he was tasked on that year-long journey with looking for potential sites to build forts for the Army. And he was very good at looking at those places along the Mississippi that could provide good defense of the upper Mississippi. It's telling that when you look at his report, the location of Fort Madison was not one of those sites. He didn't think it would be a good place to build a fort. He recommended places like Rock Island, across the river from Davenport. He recommended Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin. And ultimately, the history of the War of 1812 would bear out a lot of what he said. Virtually every place that he recommended to build a fort would eventually have a fort, but they wouldn't be built until the War of 1812 or more commonly after. So if this Army officer who was required to look for places to build forts found some very good places, but he didn't recommend the site of Fort Madison, why was a fort built there in the first place? Well, let's get to that story. In 1808, the Secretary of War was Henry Dearborn, and he thought he had Pike's report in hand, but he thought it was more important to build a trading house on the upper Mississippi River to trade with the Indians. And these trading establishments were called trade factories. They really weren't factories, but the federal government wanted to get good relationships with the native people. It thought the best way to do that was through peaceful trade. And he thought it was more important to look for a good location for a trading post, a trade factory. And so that had priority. And he originally was going to have a colonel go upriver and establish his trading site. But when that colonel died, the task fell upon a young junior officer, Lieutenant Alpha Kinsley. And he was tasked with finding the best place for a trading site, not a fort. So if you look at the map on the right there, I have Rock Island and Prairie du Chien marked out. Those were two sites that Pike recommended. Like I said, he didn't recommend Fort Madison. So Kingsley thought, well, this is a good place to build a trading fort, a trading factory. And it was a good place to trade, but it was beset with all sorts of problems that Kingsley was just probably too junior and very inexperienced to really fully understand. Okay, this map here shows the various native people who lived in the Mississippi Valley. In the immediate area around Fort Madison, the Sauk people were the principal tribe. And to the north of them were the Meskwaki or Fox. And the map's a little inaccurate. The Ho-Chunk actually had some villages that went all the way down to the Mississippi, but they lived in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Now, what's going to happen is Kingsley is going to decide to build this trade factory, but he thinks it needs protection. The native people might not be very amenable to an American presence. So he's going to co-locate Fort Madison right next to this trading factory. Now, the native people, the Sauk, they didn't mind a trading house on their land. They thought, well, this is good. We do like to get trade goods and we're willing to do it. But they saw Fort Madison as provocative. They saw it as something like an invasion of their homelands. They hadn't given the United States permission to build a fort there, and they were doing it anyway. And Kingsley is building this fort and garrisoning soldiers there so that it can protect the Indian trade factory. Again, the Indians didn't mind the trade factory, but they took much umbrage with the fort. They saw that as a provocation. Now, I like to point out that at the time that Fort Madison is being built, and he's going to build Fort Madison from 1808 to 1809, there was a growing anti-American resistance movement among the native peoples of the entire Midwest. And two of the most important leaders of that anti-American resistance movement were the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, the Shawnee Prophet. And the Shawnees at the time lived in Indiana. But their message was that we have to resist American expansion. And if we don't do it, we will lose all of our land. And they were very influential. I mean, they were influential in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, all the way into Minnesota. Their message traveled far and wide. And there were many Sauks who were very, very receptive to this message of resisting American expansion. So as Kingsley is building Fort Madison in 1808, he has his soldiers in a small temporary camp that's not particularly well built. The Sauks attempted to infiltrate the camp and wipe out Kingsley and all of his men because they saw them, they just didn't want American soldiers on their land. Kingsley managed to bring a cannon to the battle and threatened to use it, and that made the Sauk people back down. But it was indicative of the fact that there's going to be this tension between this army presence, which had never existed in Iowa before, and the native Sauk people in the nearby Meskwaki and Ho-Chunk, who also did not want to see this fort there. And there's this growing sense among the native people of the entire Midwest that we have to do something to turn back American expansion. So Kingsley and his men move in April of 1809. They finished the fort. And if you look on the right there, that's from the National Archives. That shows a diagram of the first version of the fort. I call it Fort Madison version 1.1, 160 feet wide, 201 feet long. There were 5 corners and 3 blockhouses, essentially bastions that were, basically 2-story bastions that they could fire from. The design wasn't bad. That was typical of most frontier forts. What was bad was the location. 2 things about the location. First, it was useless for defense of the upper Mississippi River. There were better locations like Rock Island and Prairie du Chien. But even for its more immediate purpose, guarding this Indian trading establishment, this trade factory, the location could not have been worse. There was a ravine 100 yards from the western wall that could provide cover for an enemy. There was a bank along the Mississippi that also could provide cover. And to the north, there was high ground, and an enemy could fire right into the middle of Fort Madison. And again, the picture on the right, I got that from an archaeological report on Fort Madison. There's been a lot of archaeological work there, and pretty accurately portrays what the surrounding terrain looked like. It was not a good location. Fort Madison was just a sitting duck, and it was just open to all sorts of attacks. And all 3 of those areas, the ravine, the riverbank, and the high ground, when native people did attack, all 3 of them would be used to attack Fort Madison. Well, how does Kingsley solve all 3 of these problems? Well, he tries to solve one of them. What he decided to do was build a 4th blockhouse on the high ground. And then he built a long stockaded walkway to this 4th blockhouse. He figured, I'll have a blockhouse on the high ground, I'll have a protected walkway to it, and that will solve the problem. Well, it's not going to solve the problem. Bit of a spoiler alert there. And the fort looked ridiculous. Everybody who saw Fort Madison said that Fort Madison had a tail. And I've looked at a lot of frontier forts in my career. None of them looked like this. It was really just sort of an awkward attempt to try to fix one of the problems, and it didn't work. Once the war starts, it will not work. And you can't, to some degree, you can't blame Alfred Kinsley. He was told to find a place to trade and build a fort next to it for protection. The trade factory had priority. And if you look at the picture at the left, it's that small rectangle, number 10, outside the stockade. If you look at the picture on the right, it's the elongated building toward the bottom right of the picture. Kingsley decided to keep that outside the fort after his incident in 1808, 1809, when the Sauk threatened to wipe out his garrison at the camp. He wanted to keep native people well outside the stockade. So this is how it's built in 1809, and it's going to have 3 years of peacetime before the War of 1812 starts. Now, I don't want to go too much into life at Fort Madison before the War of 1812. Again, I go into pretty good detail about that in the article I wrote, and I figure you can read that. But life at a frontier fort, any frontier fort, was dull, dirty, and monotonous. Food was often spoiled. Soldiers spent far more time doing arduous tasks like building and maintaining the fort, not really training to be soldiers. The picture at left shows that. And Fort Madison had its own special problems. The commanding officer after Kingsley was a guy named Captain Horatio Stark. And he was roundly hated by everybody, his men, local traders, even his superiors. He would, for minor infractions, he would have soldiers flogged with 50 lashes. And he even did that after the Army outlawed flogging, all right? The garrison was beset with sickness. For example, at one point in 1811, 2/3 of the garrison was ill. And I found a lot of things in the National Archives correspondence that just detailed the sickness and the problems. And again, Fort Madison wasn't necessarily unique in that regard. It was every frontier fort, but Horatio Stark made everything worse. His superior was Colonel Daniel Bissell, who was stationed at Fort Bellefontaine in St. Louis. And one of the things Stark did to make everybody hate him, he didn't like spending winters at Fort Madison. So he would put one of his subordinates in charge and go down to St. Louis for the winter, which was larger, much more cosmopolitan, a lot more material comforts. So he kind of left his men struggle for the winter at Fort Madison, while he just kind of had a much more relaxing time in St. Louis. Why Daniel Bissell never relieved Stark, I don't know. There were so many people, so many complaints about him. He just was a roundly hated officer. One of the things I found when I was putting this presentation together, I found about a 3-minute clip online. I don't know who put it together, but it's very well done. Fort Madison, there was a reconstruction of it built in the 1980s, something like a living history museum. But it's a really good clip, and they've done a really good job of sort of piecing together the life at a typical frontier fort. So I'm going to let you watch it. I think you'll enjoy just seeing what the look and feel, what Fort Madison would have looked like when it existed. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, I thought it was beautifully done. So let's talk about Fort Madison when the War of 1812 actually starts. And the War of 1812 actually starts in 1811. As I said, the native people of the Midwest were organizing a resistance movement against American expansion. And they were allied with the British. The British also wanted to prevent American expansion into the Midwest, because they thought that it threatened Canada, particularly what is today the province of Ontario. So the native people and the British became allies. And the war actually starts in November of 1811, when a group of Indians under the Shawnee Prophet is attacked by United States forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe in Indiana. After this battle, many native people left Tippecanoe and they went out throughout the other parts of the Midwest and began to attack isolated forts and isolated settlements. And Fort Madison would be one of them. So there was essentially an undeclared Indian war on the American frontier before the United States actually declares war in the War of 1812. So as far as the War of 1812, this just shows that Fort Madison was in many ways in part of a larger set of problems. The first few months of the war for the United States were disastrous. Just a couple examples: a group of Canadian militia, British regulars, and Indians took Fort Mackinac in July of 1812. A month later, the Potawatomis, massacred the entire garrison of Fort Dearborn, so that fell too. Probably the worst loss. The general at Detroit surrendered 1,100 men to the Indians and the British without even firing a shot. So Fort Dearborn, Mackinac, and Detroit, they all fell within the first month of the war. And that made Fort Madison really isolated. The title of the article I wrote for the Annals was called Lonely Sentinel. And if it wasn't lonely before that, it became very isolated and lonely once the three forts farther to the east had fallen, leaving it alone. So what happens once after the Battle of Tippecanoe, there will be series of small harassing actions at Fort Madison before the war actually starts. These were generally done by Ho-Chunk and Sauk people, and this was between the Battle of Tippecanoe and the War of 1812. Once the War of 1812 starts, we have three major assaults against Fort Madison. They were all done by Ho-Chunk people who lived to the north, and by the Sauks, who lived right around Fort Madison. They were allied with each other during the War of 1812. The picture on the right is Black Hawk, who was a Sauk. The figure on the left is an unnamed Ho-Chunk warrior. But of course, Black Hawk would have a long career as a native leader who sought to counter American expansion. And I want you to keep something in mind as far as the native people were concerned. This was their homeland. That's the way they saw it. They saw all these forts built on their land without their permission as basically an invasion of their homeland. And once the British signaled that they wanted an alliance, they were more than ready, more than eager to join the British in throwing the Americans out of the Midwest. So I think most of us would probably have similar sentiments in that regard. So let's just kind of go over some of the major assaults against Fort Madison and why it was abandoned. Like I said, between the start of the War of 1812 and the Battle of Tippecanoe 7 months later, there were a series of small harassing actions. 2 soldiers were killed by Ho-Chunk and Sauk warriors. One Ho-Chunk was killed near the gate. This all happened before the declaration of war. But once war is declared in the summer of 1812, then the Sauks and the Ho-Chunks have several major assaults. The largest was a 4-day assault on Fort Madison from 5 September to 8 September 1812. Now, Stark was not in command. He was down in St. Louis trying to find reinforcements, so he was gone. The person in command was one of his subordinates, Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton. I cannot find a picture of him, so I'm just using a silhouette to stand in. He was by far one of the best officers at Fort Madison. He had, absolutely excellent leader of men. Okay. And every weakness of Fort Madison was shown during this 4-day assault. The native people, the Ho-Chunk and the Sauk, attacked Fort Madison from the ravine to the west. They used the bank of the river along the Mississippi, and the tail, which led to the high ground to the north, was shown to be absolutely useless. Warriors still were able to fire into Fort Madison for 4 days, from the high ground. The blockhouse up there didn't stop it. They started shooting flaming arrows into Fort Madison, and Hamilton was worried. He was able to put all the fires out, but he was worried that eventually, something bad would happen. He wasn't able to put men inside the Indian trade factory, and he was worried that the winds might shift. He decided one night during the assault just to burn the whole Indian factory down. He figured the wind's blowing the right way, the flames will not leap onto the fort. I may as well do a controlled burn and burn it on my terms rather than the enemy's terms, which is what he did. So this sketch comes from a 1958 magazine article. I thought it was pretty good. It shows the blockhouse on the hill. It shows Hamilton burning the trade factory. So I thought that would be a good place to put this. So why didn't the Army abandon Fort Hamilton? Fort Madison. It obviously had problems. Well, it was the only fort they had in the upper Mississippi. They decided that they wanted to build a fort either at Rock Island or, better yet, Prairie du Chien. They needed some staging area by which they could move men and supplies up to a better location. So they decided, despite its flaws, to keep Fort Madison. Hamilton, everybody commented how bad Fort Madison's location was. Hamilton, after the assault of September of 1812, he wrote, "This garrison is in the most ineligible place that ever could have been chosen by any man, even if he would try." And that was probably the most charitable thing I read about Fort Madison. Now, they did reinforce it after the September assault. It had, most of the time before the war started, it had 50 men, maybe 1/3 of whom would be either under arrest or in the infirmary for sickness. They boosted up the strength to 150 men. Again, it wasn't a great fort, but it was the only fort they had. So they figured, well, we'll put more soldiers in there, and eventually we'll stockpile supplies and move them up to Prairie du Chien and create a stronger defense on the upper Mississippi. After the September assault, Hamilton tried to do everything he could to sort of bolster the defenses. First of all, he started to cut away much of the ravine in front of Fort Madison, or the bank in front of Fort Madison along the river. He couldn't do that with the ravine, though. The ravine was too big, and he could sort of cut away some of the bank in front of the fort on the Mississippi and just have a better field of fire. But the ravine was too big, and it was, he didn't have enough men for that. A second attack occurred in July of 1813 on Fort Madison. So I'll keep this one up here. There were 2 soldiers on a wood cutting detail. There was no prolonged siege in September. I don't know how many soldiers were there for the first attack, probably 200 or 300. The second attack in July of 1813, probably 100 native people. There were 100 soldiers in the fort. But unlike the September siege, the second siege in July of 1813, it didn't result in a prolonged siege. The native people were happy with having killed 2 soldiers outside the gate on a wood cutting detail, having a short exchange of fire with the fort, and then going off. Now, the next attack would come a week later. Hamilton realized that the ravine to the west was a big problem, and he had to do something. So what he did is he had a trench dug from one of the blockhouses to the ravine, and he built yet a 5th blockhouse there. I don't have a diagram of it, so I used my earlier diagram. She used the red arrows. This right here was the trench, probably about 3 feet deep. So soldiers had some cover as they went to the new blockhouse, and the blockhouse was built right on the ravine, so he at least could have some soldiers covering that. it was a good idea, but Native people just figured out ways around it. They decided we won't attack this blockhouse. Every blockhouse would have holes cut into the wall that were called loopholes from which soldiers could shoot out. One Sauk warrior, this is 8 days late. This is the third attack that came 8 days after the second attack in July. One of the Native people, a Sauk chief named Wishit, took a long spear and shoved it really quickly through one of the loopholes. And he impaled and killed 4 soldiers inside the blockhouse, within a few minutes. The third and final assault, which came a week after the second assault on this new blockhouse, it took all of 10 minutes, and it was by far the most lethal. At least 4 people, 4 soldiers were killed. And no Indians were killed. And they didn't use firearms. They used this spear thrust inside one of the loopholes. And later in the 1830s, the Sauk chief who did this, Wishit, he posed for a painting with the spear he had used to kill 4 soldiers at Fort Hamilton in 1813. So why was Fort Hamilton, I keep saying that, I'm sorry, Fort Madison abandoned? I liked Hamilton. He was a great young officer. Well, first of all, a total of 6 soldiers were killed in July of 1813. 3 others had been killed before that. So a total of 9 soldiers were killed during the War of 1812. Not a huge number, but 9 lives nonetheless. Probably a similar number of Native people were killed. So while the death toll wasn't high on either side, why was Fort Madison abandoned? Well, in October of 1813, a few months after the last assault, Hamilton, who was still in command, he looked at all the food and he noticed that it had all been spoiled. There was no food. All the flour was moldy. All the pork was rancid. And winter was about to set in, and he wasn't going to be able to get any more food. He made a command decision. He said, you know what? We're abandoning Fort Madison. It's just vulnerable to assault. We keep losing soldiers. We can't really bring any fire upon the enemy. And now we're looking at the specter of starvation over the winter. This is not worth it to hold this. I'm just making the decision. We're getting everything on flatboats. We're going down to St. Louis, and we'll work with, I'll work with my superiors to maybe develop another post at Prairie du Chien or Rock Island. This place is just cursed. So he gives the order in October to abandon. It takes about 2 weeks to load up all the equipment and men on flatboats. And he decided, as he was, as a last measure, he set the entire fort on fire just so that the enemy could not use it. So again, a total of 9 soldiers were killed during the War of 1812. We don't know the Native losses, but probably something quite similar. Now, I'm not going to go into what happens in the, after Fort Madison is abandoned and after it's burned. I'll give you a real short synopsis. During the War of 1812, the U.S. does build a new post on the upper Mississippi, but at Prairie du Chien. And there will be a post at Prairie du Chien that the U.S. Army will garrison into the 1850s. Fort Madison will never be occupied again. There were simply better sites. The report of Zebulon Montgomery Pike basically was kicked into action, but it took the War of 1812 to take that report more seriously. Because Fort Madison was burned, the only thing that was left after the fire was done were all the chimneys that had been built. And those would be taken down by later settlers. But later on, they decided to put some commemorative plaque at Fort Madison. And the Daughters of the American Republic between 1908 and 1913 decided to erect a monument on the site of where Fort Madison was. You can see the plaque at the left. And what they did is they built a chimney stack and a fireplace, because for many years between Fort Madison's evacuation and the onset of white settlement, people noted as you went down the Mississippi, you saw these charred, smokestacks and chimneys rising from the ruins, kind of like ghosts of Fort Madison past. Of course, those, as I said, those were all torn down with white settlement. But in the early part of the 20th century, they built one of those sort of abandoned chimneys and fireplaces to to commemorate the location of Fort Madison. In 1985, as I said, they built a replica of the fort that was built on the site. I'm going to show you, it was just recently in January, they've shut down, unfortunately, they've shut down the replica fort at Fort Madison due to structural problems. I found a recent news clip. I'm going to finish off my presentation with that news clip, and then I'll take questions. So let's watch this clip, and then we'll have questions. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so I do hope they find the funding, but I figured that would be a kind of a good way to wrap this up. It was only recently this happened back in January, and I can see there they tried to build it to look like an old real fort, but old real forts were rickety. So at this point, that's everything in my presentation. I wanted to leave enough time for questions, so I am going to turn it back to Matt and see what questions people have.
Well, thank you, Patrick. We do have some time to answer some questions. And if you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. And our first question, there was an issue with sound on the last clip. Can you just summarize what the last clip was about for us?
Okay, did you not hear that, or what?
We did not. No, unfortunately, we did not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there was no sound. I don't know why that was. I accidentally hit my keyboard. Okay, so I apologize for that. I heard it on my computer, so I guess I assumed everybody else did too. I must have accidentally muted something. They're shutting down in January. They closed the replica fort at Fort Madison because it's just structurally unsound. They built it in the 1980s. And they tried to make it look like a real fort from the frontier era, and they did. The problem is that that things weren't built real well, back on the frontier, and it's just been underfunded, undermaintained. So now a lot of the buildings they have there are just not structurally sound and dangerous. So they don't want people going in there. And so the city of Fort Madison is looking to try to raise funds to renovate basically what's a living history museum. Sorry about the sound. As I say, it didn't have that happen on my end. So yeah, the fun of Zoom meetings, that's for sure.
Exactly. And no worries. The link will also be included in our follow-up email for everyone to watch it too. Okay. So they'll have access to that as well. Our next question.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. Did access to both the Mississippi and the Des Moines River have an impact on Fort Madison?
Mostly to the Mississippi, not so much the Des Moines. At the time, the War Department in let's say 1805 to 1808, that's when it's making decisions on what to put on the Mississippi River. The United States had really no presence at all on the upper Mississippi. I mean, none. And it didn't really need access to the Des Moines River or control of the Des Moines River. You know, there were fur traders and native people who used the upper Mississippi and the Des Moines. What it really needed was a good location near the Des Moines River for trade and on the Mississippi, because that was kind of a highway. But the principal goal of Fort Madison was to build a trade center. And the fort was largely there just to protect the trading. It was just in a poor location to do it. So the Des Moines River, I think, played into that somewhat, because then you could get traders and native people coming down from the Des Moines. But that was sort of secondary importance to looking for a good place on the Mississippi where the Sauk, the Ho-Chunk, and the Meskwaki people would come.
Our next question, is there any indication of why the fort wasn't abandoned or moved due to the bad geography before the War of 1812 started?
Because, you know, you'd have to really do a lot of detail into the frontier army. It was, I mean, America was really a third-rate power at the beginning of the War of 1812. The army was small, it was poorly trained, poorly paid. It would probably be, the U.S. Army was similar to probably a lot of, the armies of developing countries today. It was not, I mean, there were only a few thousand people in the U.S. Army before the War of 1812. A modern infantry division would probably have more people in it today than the entire U.S. Army. They didn't have enough men. They were constantly deserting. They were constantly getting sick. The United States Army, in short, just didn't have the men, money, or resources to move it. Once it was built, there was just not like they could say, we made a mistake, let's move it. During the War of 1812, the Congress would basically vote for more money for the war, larger appropriation, and a new fort would be built at Prairie du Chien. But before the War of 1812, they couldn't, the Congress was suspicious of a standing army in the first place, and Congress had to be the ones to vote the money. And before the War of 1812, that just was not going to happen.
Our next question, usually around forts, a settler's village grows around it. How about at Fort Madison?
Well, no, had Fort Madison not been evacuated, yes, that almost certainly would have happened, because that's what happens at Fort Dearborn. It's what happens at Fort Howard at Green Bay, Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien. Yeah, almost certainly that would have happened. And there were a few French-Canadian traders who lived in the area of Fort Madison. And again, you have to understand, this was the first real English-speaking settlement in Iowa. Why didn't more English-speaking people come? Because the people who did live in the region were French-speaking fur traders who had been in the upper Mississippi for over a century. So why didn't Anglo-Americans from, say, Connecticut or Kentucky come? Mainly because the government hadn't opened up the land for settlement. No white settler was going to go west and settle on land unless they could get clear title to it. That doesn't happen until 1832. So had Fort Madison not been evacuated, yeah, eventually the government would have surveyed the land, it would have opened it up for settlement, it would have put it up for sale, people could come in and get clear title to it. But before 1832, that just didn't happen. So there were still sort of these itinerant French fur traders coming, stopping by, but certainly not white settlers looking for a permanent home, not till 1832.
We'll continue that conversation of area
Sure.
around Fort Madison. A question came in about other trading posts. When did other trading posts open in the area surrounding Fort Madison then?
Okay, well, it depends it depends how you want to approach the question. If you want to look just at American trading posts, what were called trade factories, most of these government-run trade factories were built by forts. As I recall, Fort Dearborn had one. Fort Howard had one after the War of 1812. So you can probably look at a map of some of these early forts that dotted the landscape, and not all, but many of them did have trade factories. Now, if you want to just cut out the United States, what about the French and the Spanish who'd been in the region for upwards of 2 centuries before Fort Madison? Well, St. Louis was a trade center, and a lot of the furs from the Missouri River found their way to St. Louis, as did furs from the upper Mississippi. Prairie du Chien was a trade center and a French settlement. Green Bay was a French fur trade settlement. So if you want to look at French fur trade settlements, well, those went back for well over a century. And St. Louis, Prairie du Chien, Chicago, Green Bay, those were all fur trade centers, but those predated the entry of United States citizens. Does that answer the question? Let me make sure I answered it first.
I think it does really well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And our next question, and this will actually be our last question that we have today.
Okay, sure.
So a question about the people who were in Fort Madison. Are garrison lists, soldiers' names for various periods at Fort Madison available to the public?
Again, virtually, all of my research, and I just for the person who might be interested, you can. My article will be available. I cite every source I have, as people like Stark and Hamilton would have to write reports to their superior Bissell in St. Louis. They would often, make a report of the available men. Sometimes with names, sometimes they would just provide, numbers. But the post returns, as they're called, those always listed the names of officers, sometimes the names of enlisted men. Before the War of 1812, I noticed the post reports could be really sporadic. The U.S. Army got a lot more strict about submitting those after the War of 1812. But virtually everything I used to write my article, I found as handwritten manuscripts in the United States National Archives, and that's all sitting there. Of course, you got to go all the way to Washington and go downtown by the Navy Memorial, get into the reading room with a card, and look at the manuscripts. It's not easy to do, but some of that stuff I actually have. I need copies of it. I have it on my computer, in fact, but yeah, that's all there. And it's you have to go to the National Archives to see it all. So let me know if that answers the question, or if there's any follow-up questions.
That does. And actually, I did say last question, but I have a question for you. I like
Sure.
to ask this of our people doing the 101s is, how did you become interested in researching this topic?
Okay, well, first of all, I became in Fort Madison, in my mind, is part of a much larger research program. When I was in graduate school, I had Father Francis Paul Pruka as one of my professors. He was one of the most brilliant American historians, I think, that I ever worked with. And certainly his reputation at the time, he was considered one of the top historians in the United States. And he did a lot of research on frontier America and the frontier army. And that got me interested in that overall topic. Of course, once you're a young graduate student, you're looking to write a dissertation, you're looking to write books and articles. The first book I wrote was on the Black Hawk War of 1832. And of course, I had to write about all these battles between the US Army and the Sacs in the War of 1812, and Fort Madison, figured prominently into those. Well, after I got done with my Black Hawk War book, I said, the history of Fort Madison, that deserves more than the couple paragraphs I gave it in a chapter. It deserves a much more extensive treatment. And so I already had some of it, and I found the story interesting. And I have to thank the state, the State Historical Society of Iowa. They gave me a research grant so I could do some more research, and that gave me at least some money to get back out to Washington to look at some more things in the National Archives. So it's just sort of my abiding interest in frontier America, the frontier army. Again, I think Father Pruka had a great addition to American history, that the frontier army was this crucial institution for pushing westward. I think what he said was far more important than what Frederick what Frederick Jackson Turner said. So it's just part of it's a smaller piece of a larger puzzle, and that puzzle is understanding the history of frontier America, particularly here in the Midwest.
That's great. And with that answer,
that's the short answer. I could give a whole 1 hour talk just on my research and why I'm interested in it. So
that's fantastic. And with that answer, though, we will bring this webinar to a close. We're near the end of the hour. But thank you to everyone joining us today. And I'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Patrick. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months, and we hope you can join us. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look in some other fantastic programs we have, such as our Goalies Kids Club activities for young historians. Now, we look forward to virtually seeing you here again for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on April 13th. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. And my email's on this page. If anybody wants to shoot me an email, I'll be happy to take further questions.